Welcome into the Pro Football Network NFL YouTube channel. My name is Arif Hasan, and today we're going to be talking about my power rankings for the best offenses in the NFL. We built a model that takes into account trades, the drafts, free agency. Should be a ton of fun. 32 teams ranked, coming your way right now. But before we get into the content of that video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so that you get notified when new content comes in. We've got a ton more content dropping soon. You're not going to want to miss it. Now, my power rankings for the best offenses in the NFL. At number 32, probably not a huge surprise, the worst offense in the NFL belongs to the Los Angeles Rams. Even if we give the Rams some credit for Matthew Stafford potentially rebounding and having a better year in 2023 than he did in 2022, there's virtually no supporting cast around him. Of course, he has Cooper Kupp to throw to, but besides that, the receiving group around him is fairly weak, and the weak offensive line has only gotten worse. There's little in the way of a complete offense. Cam Akers at running back can't be expected to shoulder a complete season, and a fifth-round receiver like Puka Nacua shouldn't be expected to take over for Van Jefferson and displace him from the offense entirely. It's tough to see a Sean McVay offense land at the bottom of the pack, but the Rams intentionally gambled their future for the Super Bowl run, and this is where they end up, a team with more rookies added to their 90-man roster than any other in the NFL. At 31 comes an offense from another offensive genius, the Atlanta Falcons. The design that head coach Arthur Smith provides for that offense is pretty phenomenal, but that's not a part of what the model accounts for, and even then, we see a weak receiving core that's overly penalized from last year's performances, maybe a down year from Kyle Pitts and incoming tight end Jonnu Smith, but without some of the ancillary players like Olamide Zaccheaus and an upgrade at a position and strength in Bijan Robinson, there's not much for the Falcons to hang their hat on. We're going to have to expect that somebody like third-round pick Desmond Ridder has the ability to come in and compete at a starting level, but we just don't know what that offense is going to look like, and given the fact that they already had a pretty strong running game without Robinson, this offseason didn't provide much in the way of upgrades for this offense. The hope is that Drake London can take a leap forward, but even then, there's just not a lot to work with. At 30 is the Washington Commanders. This is another unknown at quarterback, but this time it's a fifth-round pick instead of a third-round pick. Sam Howell played well in his limited time under center, but the model projects the performance of a typical late-round quarterback in their second year. That might be a little bit unfair to him, but we have to make some decisions, and it's hard to figure out what he's going to do. There is a really great receiving core. We should expect a little bit more from Jahan Dotson this year. Terry McLaurin is one of the more underrated receivers in the NFL, and they've got a great roster of running backs to help support him, but with a weak offensive line, there's not much that receiving group can do to improve their odds of winning. And number 29 is an offense that struggled a lot more than many people expected last year, the Tennessee Titans. If we see the 2019 Ryan Tannehill, this offense has the ability to be a top 10 offense, flipping the field, but the weaknesses that they've developed along the offensive line, at receiver, and the overall decline in the performance of the running game, and even with Ryan Tannehill himself, it means that they might have one of the worst offenses. We can't expect somebody like Treylon Burks to shoulder the load, especially because his rookie year production doesn't track historically with first-round receivers that tend to do well going down the line. Even if that happens, there's not much of a receiving core around him. They haven't been able to replace the tight end depth that they used to have, and that offensive line has only gotten worse, not better. So, the Tennessee Titans ranked 29th. At 28th is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, they could expect another leap forward for Kenny Pickett, who did look a little bit better at the end of last season, but it is difficult to project that kind of performance going into his second year to be something that can change the league. Adding Broderick Jones and Isaac Seumalo was big for that offensive line, which was pretty weak, but there's not much reason to believe that the receiving core can really put it together for Kenny Pickett. He's projected to make some improvements in our model, but he suffers because he had some help with unsustainable types of play like contested catch percentage. George Pickens is a really fun to watch receiver, but he hasn't demonstrated consistency, and his highlight catches are a difficult thing for an offense to rely on if they want to consistently score points. And number 27 is the Chicago Bears. Justin Fields is one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL last year, but he has some rushing production to fall back on, and a new receiving core that should be substantially better. That should give the offense a little bit higher of a floor than they had at the beginning of last year. When that offense included more rushing, they were more productive, and that might be a big part of what Justin Fields has to rely on because he did look better in the second half of the year. The Bears made big additions to the offensive line, and that receiving core not just has Chase Claypool, who they traded for in the middle of last season, but DJ Moore as well, which should help them out pretty substantially. Darnell Mooney no longer has to carry the load. The additions that they made along the offensive line should also help them, and they should find themselves comfortably outside of that last place conversation in the offense. Any more than that, they're going to need a huge leap in Fields' passing potential. At 26 is the Houston Houston Texans. Now, the model should say that there's an improvement at quarterback when they add a first-round receiver, and there is an improvement. The model projects that C.J. Stroud's going to be a better quarterback than Davis Mills, and I think that that's pretty fair. But the weak supporting cast maybe got worse with the loss of Brandon Cooks, trading him away. Adding Shaquille Mason, Robert Woods, that certainly helps, but the offensive line overall is likely still going to struggle, and there isn't a premier receiver to replace Brandon Cooks' snaps. At 25 is the Indianapolis Colts, another team that should improve with the addition of a first-round quarterback, and their quarterback play will get better. But the underperformance of the offensive line last year weighs heavily on our model. Maybe that's not fair. Maybe the offensive line coaching is going to get a lot more out of a fairly talented unit that has Quentin Nelson, but for right now, we don't think that that offensive line is going to be enough to protect Anthony Richardson. Plus, Anthony Richardson is going to be a little bit more raw as a quarterback, so underweighting what the Colts can do seems to be the safe play. It might be a little bit unfair. They do project a worse receiving unit without Paris Campbell. Josh Downs maybe should be able to help them, and they've got a lot of potential with Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce, but for now, it's more potential than it is talent. At 24th is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Losing Tom Brady is a pretty big loss. Not as big as you might think, given how poorly that offense performed last year, but it still brings the Buccaneers back as they rely on a relatively unknown second-round quarterback in Kyle Trask in order to make things better. They seemingly have a better overall supporting cast than the quarterbacks that are unknown but are higher up on this list, but that just isn't as appealing given how important that quarterback position is in projecting future play. Not only that, the receiving core, which is primarily, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, they haven't played as well over the past 2 years as their reputation suggests, and so that kind of limits what Kyle Trask can do within this offense. At 23 of the Green Bay Packers, there's another unknown at quarterback, but he is a first-round pick, and so the model likes him a little bit more than it likes Kyle Trask. The historical level of play for quarterbacks who sit for multiple seasons is not that great, and so that's going to be a little bit of an issue, but it doesn't account that, he was sitting behind a Hall of Fame quarterback, and there are limitations that come with every model. Nevertheless, Christian Watson's the only receiver that the model thinks could turn into a premier weapon, and though the supporting cast is full of promise, they added 5 pass catchers in the draft, it's mostly pessimistic about those receivers turning in game-changing performances at least this year. In the long run, that could change, but a good offensive line like the one Green Bay has can only take you so far. And number 22 is the New Orleans Saints. The model loves Derek Carr. It should help the offense improve in some pretty big ways, but the receiving core isn't projected to do well outside of Chris Olave. Maybe we can see that old Michael Thomas return. Maybe we can see Rashid Shaheed take the next step, but for now, there isn't much in the way of receiving options, and that offensive line isn't as good as it was 2-3 years ago, and so there are some holes here with the New Orleans Saints offense. It'll be difficult to dig themselves out of. At 21 is the Cleveland Browns. It was really difficult to figure out how well Deshaun Watson was going to do. If we only took his last year of play, we weren't going to get a very good player. The Cleveland Browns actually would have ranked worse offensively if that's what we were relying on, but we also can't assume that Watson is going to move up to MVP quality play. So if we split the difference, we find the Browns here ranked around 21, and there are real-world concerns that Watson's not going to regain that level of play from before. Adding players like Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman, that all helps, but it doesn't mean much without that improvement at quarterback, despite a pretty good offensive line. At number 20 is the Arizona Cardinals. One would think that an offense with Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins could really do some damage, but there have been concerns all across that offensive line, even with 2 additions in the draft, one of them in the first round with Paris Johnson, but even with that in mind, that offensive line is projected to struggle, and there's not a ton of promise at the other skill positions outside of DeAndre Hopkins. They're going to need to see more development from Rondale Moore. They're going to need to see more from the ancillary receivers that they've collected around DeAndre Hopkins, and he's no longer the top receiver in the NFL, so it's difficult to rely on him to have a consistent level of play that can bring this offense forward by himself. And number 19 is the New England Patriots. They suffer for not having any receivers. That's a big part of what the model dislikes about them, but they do project an improvement in play for Mac Jones, who performed better in 2021 as a rookie than he did in 2022. Perhaps adding a real offensive coordinator is going to change things for him. That's not enough to move them into the top half of the league, even though they've made some changes along the offensive line that should help, but it does move them into a little bit more of a respectable area, and if the Patriots produce their historically great defenses once again, they could make some noise. At number 18 are the New York Giants. Daniel Jones was one of the most improved players in the NFL last year, but those kinds of improvements are difficult to count on, and so we're including some of his previous performances as part of the model as well, and that drags him down a little bit. Plus, the passing performance from Daniel Jones is not as good as it is for some of the other running quarterbacks, as we'll see later on in the list. Not having a strong receiving core hurts them, though it's clearly a lot better than it was last year. They made a couple of investments there in the draft, but specifically when they traded for tight end Darren Waller, who has been a big part of the improvement in projections that the Giants would normally not be expected to have. They also made a couple of investments along the offensive line. That's going to be important, but if they don't see an improvement from right tackle Evan Neal, it's not really going to matter. The Giants would be ranked lower without all of those changes because it is difficult to project that Daniel Jones is going to put together a really high-level passing performance, but they do have a lot of pieces to make sure that that happens. At number 17 are the Detroit Lions. Now, last year they were one of the top offenses in the NFL, but the problem is the way that they scored points was historically unsustainable. The model doesn't really like the way that they produce those points because it doesn't translate into something in the year following. They relied on explosive non-quarterback runs, they relied a little bit on turnover luck, and they relied a lot on dependency on yards after the catch, which are pretty notoriously volatile. In fact, in the second half of the season, we saw the Lions, after they started winning games, reduce their offensive output a little bit. And maybe they do that again, but without a change at quarterback, which could happen now that they've drafted Hendon Hooker, there's a ceiling on what the Lions are projected to do, even though they've got a really good offensive line. They've got a pretty interesting receiving group led by Amon-Ra St. Brown with a first-rounder that is going to be fully healthy this year. It's just tough to see the Lions entering the top half after the way they unsustainably produced points last year. At 16 are the Denver Broncos. This is another case where regression helps the quarterback rather than hurts them, and when we take a look at the historical performance of Russell Wilson to try and see how he's going to do heading into 2023. It's just as likely that he'll improve as he will stay the same, and so with Sean Payton there, we may be able to see some improvements overall in the offensive design. In fact, we saw that after an interim coach came in and took over for the offense, and so it is entirely possible that that offense improves in a big way now that they've got a pretty good receiving core, a pretty decent offensive line, and the possibility that the quarterback could do a lot better. And if that's the case, under Sean Payton, the sky is the limit for this offense. They're probably not going to finish the year ranked at 16. The question is whether or not they're going to enter the top 5 or the bottom 5, now relying on a new look Russell Wilson. And number 15 are the Seattle Seahawks. This is a team that ranked about 9th or so in points scored in the NFL last year, but 13th in expected points per play. There's a little bit of regression in play here. Plus, there is some expectation that Geno Smith, who's a bit of a one-year wonder, may regress in his level of play. We've seen one-and-done quarterbacks before, players like Case Keenum, Josh McCown, Nick Foles. It's difficult to find players who explode in performance one year and then maintain that level of performance in multiple years. It's possible that he falls off after a strong start. Adding a first-round receiver in Jackson Smith-Njigba is nice. They may have the best 3 receivers in the league right now, but they still need to resolve some of their pass protection issues. It was actually their 4th-round pick, Abraham Lucas, that was a little bit better in pass protection than their 1st-round pick, Charles Cross, and there are still a little bit of issues up the middle in terms of pass protection that they're going to have to resolve before they can move up these rankings and be a reliable offense that people can count on. At 14 are the Las Vegas Raiders. Jimmy Garoppolo is a statistically sound quarterback, and he's been paired with a high-level receiver in Devontae Adams, an overall unit that has seen a number of pass-catching additions. They still need pass protection help, but the overall prognosis is that Garoppolo units, on paper, are pretty positive. Jacoby Myers should help. They still need some help along the offensive line, and depending on whether or not Hunter Renfrow stays with them throughout the offseason, they could have a pretty complete receiving group. At 13 are the Carolina Panthers. This is probably the biggest surprise of the list. Carolina ranked 21st in EPA per play last year, but the first overall pick tends to play at about a league average rate in their rookie year, meaning that that upgrade at quarterback could drive some pretty excellent results. Now, they lost DJ Moore in their move to get Bryce Young. That's going to be pretty significant, but they gained a number of receivers in free agency. They added a 2nd rounder in Jonathan Mingo, and the net downgrade at receiver is buffeted by the fact that there's a better kind of depth and supporting cast around that receiving position. At 12 are the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota Vikings lost Adam Thielen to the Carolina Panthers, but the model considers Jordan Addison, first-round receiver, to be a little bit of an upgrade. The Vikings did not improve their pass protection. They have the same offensive line as they did last year, but they have an elite pair of tackles. That's just a good thing to have, and a functional interior. Importantly, the contribution that Justin Jefferson could provide in helping Kirk Cousins improve the passing game should help the offense compete for a top 10 rank. Even if they do end up losing Dalvin Cook, they'll find ways to produce offense, and it helps that Kevin O'Connell is helping run that unit. At 11 are the Jacksonville Jaguars. There should be some improvement coming for Trevor Lawrence, and the offense is projected to improve with the first and second round investments that they've made there. They weren't active in free agency, but the performance of the receivers was pretty fruitful last year. You take a look at what Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk were able to do. Adding another tight end and another receiver isn't a bad thing. If they can improve their pass protection while maintaining that same quality at receiver, they should be able to score some points. At 10 are the Dallas Cowboys. A lot here relies on Dak Prescott maintaining the high level of statistical play that he has over the past several years, even though last year was a bit of a step back after he returned from injury. He is a bit of a statistical darling, kind of like Tony Romo, and we haven't seen him perform well in clutch moments, but that is something that is pretty difficult to model going forward. The Cowboys are expected to see some improvements because of their willingness to make moves for players like Brandon Cooks and Luke Schoonmaker, but having that along with CeeDee Lamb should mean that they've got a diverse receiving offense. It should be difficult to defend. The model is a bit suspect of about half of their offensive lines. The offense isn't projected to do all-world numbers, but the foundation is there. At number 9 are the Los Angeles Chargers. It's been pretty difficult to model how well the Chargers are going to do because of the number of injuries that we see for their offensive line, as well as for Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, but adding Quentin Johnson to that stacked receiving unit helps improve their projected offense overall, helps their depth, buffers them against injury there, and Justin Herbert is expected to play extremely well. Without offensive line upgrades, it's tough to place the Chargers higher than this, and maybe the model doesn't do a great job accounting for health issues, but for now, it's difficult to trust the Chargers to be anything more than a fringe top 10 team in terms of offense. At number 8 are the San Francisco 49ers. Now, this model projects that Brock Purdy is going to be the one that plays the entire season. Technically, we don't know if that's going to be the case. Sam Darnold could start the season, and that would be pretty difficult in terms of offensive production, even though he ended the year pretty strong in Carolina. By pure EPA per play last year, Brock Purdy's 49ers were an elite passing offense, though it never really felt that way. After accounting for the elements in the model that discount unsustainable styles of play, like yards after catch dependency, dropped interceptions, fumble retention, and so on, there's a discount applied to his play. They still end up as a top 8 offense overall, though, because of how well that design enables receivers like Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Kyle Juszczyk, and George Kittle. There's some concern about pass protection after losing Mike McGlinchey, but overall, it's a pretty solid unit. At number 7 are the Baltimore Ravens. Re-signing Lamar Jackson was, of course, massive, but so was adding Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers. Without some changes along the offensive line, there's a bit of a cap placed on the offense, but they've historically had some pretty good performances there. We should be able to see some improvement just by the nature of the amount of talent that they have, and Jackson is projected to play more like his 2019 self than his 2022 self, although he's probably not going to put up MVP numbers like he did then. If so, that's probably the reason that they would enter the top 5. As for right now, splitting the difference between his highs and his lows, the Ravens rank 7th. At 6th are the New York Jets. Adding Aaron Rodgers to a receiving core featuring Garrett Wilson was huge, though it also helps that the Jets were aggressive about adding additional receivers and offensive linemen. Receivers like Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb were familiar with Aaron Rodgers, and a couple of other receivers as well, and making sure that that offensive line has the depth and breadth to handle injuries at multiple positions. The model might still be a little bit too high on the health of that offensive line going forward, but if they are healthy, it'll be difficult to take Rodgers down, who's already a premier quarterback in terms of sack avoidance, should be able to create some big plays in the process. At number 5 are the Miami Dolphins. We expect Tua Tagovailoa to play 2023 completely healthy, and that might be a little bit aggressive, but that's part of the projection here, and the Dolphins were a pretty high-level offense when he was running it. They still need to improve their offensive line. That's been a consistent issue for them, but they have good depth there after free agency in the draft and should be a more resilient team dealing with injury. Having Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle obviously is a pretty big boon, and they're expected to have a fairly complete offense with Mike McDaniel running it. At number 4, the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Burrow is neck and neck with Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts in terms of projected performance, and the pass protection upgrade that the Bengals received should help in a big way. Orlando Brown is going to help solidify that unit that was probably their biggest weakness offensively. Even with simply above average run blocking too, their excellent receiving unit and high-level quarterback play put them in the top 5. At number 3, the Philadelphia Eagles. They should, like always, anticipate an elite pass blocking unit, a high-level run blocking operation, and a great run game overall. Adding a number of premier running backs, both Rashad Penny and DeAndre Swift, to replace Miles Sanders was pretty big for them. Having a receiver like Olamide Zaccheaus to complement, that duo of A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith is going to be big, but they were basically a great offense last year, and they should be a great offense this year. At number 2 are the Buffalo Bills. A completely healthy Josh Allen, one not mitigated by an elbow injury, should be able to make some waves, even without a complete receiving cast around Stephon Diggs, something that has been a bit of a problem over the last year and a half for Buffalo. Adding Dalton Kincaid in the draft boosted their score, as did some of their offensive line upgrades, which means that the Buffalo Bills are probably going to be a little bit more of a complete team, and they'll be an even better team if it turns out that James Cook can improve. And at number 1, who else would it be? It'd be the Kansas City Chiefs. They have the best offense in the NFL, but this year it's a little bit closer than most. The model naturally plays Patrick Mahomes as the top quarterback, but it's suspicious the changes that they've made along the offensive line. The combination of Donovan Smith and Jawan Taylor are combined downgrades from the duo of Orlando Brown Jr. and Andrew Wiley, and the receiver changes continue to make the Chiefs look a little bit precarious. But if you take a step back from the raw numbers, it's easy to see why the Chiefs should take the top spot. Mahomes is a wizard, the offense is coordinated by one of the finest minds in the NFL, and even if they do take a small step back in pass protection, they should be able to slice through opposing defenses with no problem. And hey, I didn't even mention the best tight end in the NFL. He plays for them too. Thanks for tuning in. Do you agree with the list? Let me know in the YouTube comments below. And while you're there, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you get notified for when new content drops.